Welcome back to the channel. Well, I'm excited about a new OV-10 Bronco model available for Microsoft Flight Simulator that's available free from the flightsim.to website. I'm especially interested in this aircraft because back in about 1980, I flew this aircraft in Germany with the US Air Force. I thought it would be fun to take this for a little spin around the area I used to fly in Germany and tell you a little bit about that and compare this aircraft model to the actual aircraft and point out some of the great features and also point out some areas that there could be a little improvement to make it more realistic compared to the real airplane. Well, as I said, back about 1978, I was flying the F-4 Phantom fighter in North Carolina, and I got orders to fly the OV-10 Bronco in Germany. Needless to say, this wasn't a dream assignment for a young fighter pilot. Nevertheless, I now look back on those 3 years spent in Germany as some of the funnest times of my life. Here I am circled in yellow in a 1981 squadron photo. We were the 704th Tactical Air Support Squadron at Simbach Air Base in then West Germany. Since our primary mission was to help the Army deploy close air support and support of ground troops, all of us were supposed to be previous fighter pilots. Now, about the time I got to the squadron, the Air Force didn't want to send all their expensively trained fighter pilots to support the Army. So they started taking pilots right out of pilot training and putting them through a 8-sortie course. In the T-38 they had flown at pilot training called Fighter Lead-In to give them the basics of fighter pilots and blessing them as fighter pilots and sending them off to support the Army. Eventually, this made up about half of the pilots in the squadron. Fortunately, this mix of youthful enthusiasm and fighter experience turned out to be the perfect mix for a squadron that was both fun and capable of doing the job. And little did we realize that unlike a frontline fighter unit, we weren't under the microscope all the time. We really did have a little flying club there at Simbach Air Base. We could take the planes to unusual places for cross countries. And sometimes when there were no fighters available, which is pretty common, we could just go out and fly around the countryside and enjoy the scenery. Except for the large built-up areas, we could fly around anywhere pretty much at 500 feet and enjoy looking around. By the end of 3 years, most everyone could find their way around most of central and southern Germany just by looking at landmarks. Well, all good things come to an end, and about 1984, all the OV-10s were redeployed to George Air Force Base in California. And about 1987, they were retired. So now let's take a look at the Ariebaba free OV-10 Bronco. Stick around till the end and I'll tell you where you can download the free OV-10 model for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and also where you can get this cool European camo livery. When the OV-10s first came to Europe, they still had the gray paint job that was left over from Vietnam. During my time in Germany, we slowly converted over to a green camo paint scheme similar to the one you see here. Much better for the German environment, and I really like the way it looks. So let's take a look at the Ariebaba OV-10, the good and the bad, and let me show you where I used to fly in Germany. Well, first, I have to say I was blown away by the very nice exterior appearance of this aircraft. Great modeling, great textures, looks really nice. As an Air Force veteran, of course, I picked the Air Force livery from the three that were supplied, and it wasn't until after I looked at the video that I realized there weren't sponsons. Those are the stubby little wing-like structures you see here on the side of the fuselage that hold stores, and they also have an M60, actually four M60 7.62 millimeter machine guns with 500 rounds each, I think. The rear fuselage tail cone is also a door for putting cargo in the aft part of the fuselage. The little cargo area was extremely useful, especially when going cross country when you wanted to bring goodies home for your wife. By removing the tail cone, the aircraft could accommodate 5 fully equipped paratroopers or 6 combat troops for counterinsurgency missions. And that's not all the tricks that the OV-10 had up its sleeve. Another feature of the OV-10 was the trailing link landing gear system. You can see that all the gear have this function. This allows operation off of extremely rough airfields. In fact, during training, they showed us a video of an OV-10 taking off and landing on an extreme rough runway that was artificially made just to test the strength of the gear. They claimed that the aircraft could withstand more force than the pilot could. So now let's jump in this tough little bird and see what it looks like in the cockpit. Well, as you can see, it's really nicely modeled inside too. Now, this isn't Asobo or A2A quality, but it's really well done and very convincing. Having flown the real airplane for 3 years, I can say that it was very immersive and looked very realistic to me. I had to look for complaints, but I did think that the levers on the throttle quadrants were a little bit puny compared to the real thing. You can see they're pretty narrow, especially the condition levers. Also, I did find the glass to be just a little bit shiny or reflective, a little bit more reflective, especially noticeable in VR. In the right side panel there, the console on the right side of the cockpit was a bit out of scale. It looks great on a flat screen, but if you get into VR, it definitely looks like it's way too narrow compared to real life. I know it's hard to believe, but everything looks so much better in 3D. As soon as I put on the headset, I noticed that even the relief tube there was too small. I'm not boasting, but it was obvious that the scale on that side panel and the relief tube was wrong. Now let's look in the back seat. Spent a lot of time flying back here in the OV-10 as an instructor pilot. There's a little restriction to the forward view, but nothing like the F4 where you couldn't see anything out front. This airplane was extremely noisy. You know, we normally wore earplugs under a form-fitted helmet to try to mitigate that noise level because, you know, just all that plexiglass around you and right outside the window, those props turning up to 2,000 RPM. They're 8.5 foot blades, and they do make a lot of noise. Before we take a short flight, I'd like to explain how the throttle quadrant works, power levers and the condition levers, and how they relate to one another during operation. Now on the right, you have the two condition levers. They have a feather and fuel cutoff position at the bottom. The next one up is the fuel shutoff, which basically just shuts fuel off to the engine without feathering. Then the normal flight, which is used for cruise, and then takeoff and land, which is used for takeoff and landing. Takeoff and land keeps the engine running at pretty much max RPM and adjusts pitch of the propeller to adjust the power. Normal flight is quieter and it allows you to adjust the RPM with the power levers. Fuel shutoff just shuts all fuel to the engine. Feather and fuel shutoff position is for single engine operation and allows you to streamline the propeller for minimum drag when you're flying with an engine shut down. The two power levers to the left also have four positions. The top position, of course, is military, and that is full military, full takeoff power. The center position is flight idle, and produces pretty much idle thrust in flight. Below that is ground start, and I could never get it to pull into that either using the mouse or binding it to my honeycomb. I just got reverse thrust, but we hardly ever used that. That was used for ground start for right before we shut down. We would pull it into ground start and then pull the condition levers to fuel shutoff, then go immediately to full reverse and hold it there until the props stop spinning to lock them into flat pitch for the next start. Let's look at a chart from the flight manual that helps to explain the relationship between the power levers and the condition levers and what you're actually going to see in the aircraft. So in this chart on the left, you can see engine RPM, and on the bottom is the power lever position, and the various positions are marked. And you can see that for most of the range, it's a pretty much level RPM that's just about 97% or so, and it's constant. And the thrust is controlled by the amount of pitch on the propeller. So the propeller adjusts the pitch to try to maintain the RPM you see here. Of course, there is a hover speed and underspeed limit, and that is shown in red here. And the RPM is never allowed to go above or below those ranges in the takeoff and land setting. When the condition levers are in normal flight, you get quite a different look here. You can see the RPM bottoms out at about 70 instead of that 97. And then from there up to 97, it's pretty much a nice curve up there, almost linear up there, just like you would expect with a fixed pitch prop. It makes cruise flight a lot quieter. And you can see the high speed governor limit is the same and the underspeed limit is a lot lower. You can see in the orange line here. So let's take the OV-10 for a short flight and we'll fly around Ramstein Air Base in Germany near the base that I was at, which is now closed, called Simbach Air Base. When you arrive at the aircraft, hopefully the previous pilot has shut the aircraft down correctly and left the props in flat pitch on the locks so they'll be ready for starting. If not, you have to do an unfeathering procedure. It's a pretty simple by the book procedure. I'm going to copy. I found my old checklist from when I was flying the OV-10. I'm going to make a PDF of the pages and I'll post that in the a link to that in the remarks of this video. You'll not only find the unfeathering procedure there, but all the emergency and normal procedures circa 1981 are in this checklist that we carried on all our flights. So if the engines are in flat pitch, you want to put the fuel shutoffs to shut off, power levers in flight idle, battery switch on, the generator should be on. And when you're ready to start, after you do a quick check of the warning lights and fire system, of course that's in the upper glare shield, just hold the button up to test and check the fire lights, bell, and all the other warning lights are operating. Another quick check of that prop to make sure it's flat pitch. If it was feathered, it's a geared engine and the would definitely create an over temperature if you tried to start it that way. So once we're ready to start, we'll just put the start switch to start and hold it momentarily. And in a few seconds, you'll see the ignition on light and the motor or engine will start to motor. You're looking for 10% RPM, in which case we'll raise the condition lever to normal flight. We should note a rise in EGT. The oil pressure should be rising. And then we're just watching the EGT for an over temperature. And there's a procedure in the checklist for handling that. Once that engine's stabilized, we're ready to move on to the second engine, and it's exactly the same thing. Start switch on to start. Ignition light on. Watching for 10%. When it reaches 10%, the condition lever to normal flight. And then again looking for EGT rise and the oil pressure rising. And we look for the light to go out when the starter cuts out. And we look for EGT and the RPM to stabilize. Now, as part of the before taxi checklist, you need to get the props off the locks, and that you do that by going into reverse. Pull the power levers into reverse, not all the way, just in enough that they release and then go forward to back to ground start, and the prop should be released. And you'll know that when you use power that it's there's some resistance. Then the flaps are part of the before taxi checklist, and not only down to takeoff, but on down to all the way and then back up to half for takeoff. That way you make sure they do extend all the way. And be sure the chocks are removed and the parking brakes released and we're ready to taxi out to the runway. I remember when I first came to the OV-10 for training at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida, that I was surprised, although there is a nose wheel steering system and a button on the control stick to engage the nose wheel steering. That's not how we normally taxied the OV-10. We taxied it by using differential reverse thrust. Now, the problem with this model is that the reverse thrust is not instantly reactive. Even with the condition levers in normal flight, the minimum RPM would be about 70%. So pulling either throttle into reverse would cause pretty much an instant turn of the castering nose wheel to steer the airplane. It sounds kind of tricky, but it's really easier than it sounds, and you can taxi the airplane quite well using differential reverse. It's not a big deal, but it does kind of eliminate some of the realism of flying an OV-10. For those of us who came from fighters, I came from the F4, or Big Ugly as we called it. Uh, it's a slightly different experience, and it was definitely my first experience with a turboprop aircraft. So there was a lot to learn. The OV-10 is fairly slow, so it was pretty easy to fly. But the mission was quite demanding, and I'll explain a little bit more about that when we get airborne. We're going to take an intersection departure because the runway is plenty long for the OV-10, which has good short field takeoff and landing performance. Now, at the hold short line here, time to perform the before takeoff checklist. Of course, first we'll set the parking brake and then refer to our checklist. And it just includes the basic, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but flaps, trim, transponder on, and all that sort of thing, flight control check, and a collision light on, and so on. And then we're ready for departure. We'll close the canopy. And you can see the lever there. Make sure the pins are locked. There's a spring that tends to hold the canopy closed and help to open it before you put the brace in to support it to hold it up. The problem is if it's not latched, when you rotate, the air pressure will slam that open very rapidly, and the noise and breeze will get your attention. And it could even damage it a bit. So that's not that great. Anyway, when we're ready to take the active, we can do the lineup check. Normally we'll do that on the runway if we're going to sit there, but the main thing we need to do is advance the condition levers up to takeoff and land. We should see the RPM go up to almost 97%, but that doesn't happen in this model, and that's a major flaw. It really does. You'd normally hear the engine speed up, and it would be quite loud, and that's not available on this model. So that's something they need to work on. That's one reason I included that chart earlier that showed the relationship between the RPM and different condition lever settings. So as we pull onto the runway here, taking the intersection, they're nice long runway, so no problem with the OV-10, and we'll be heading off towards the east. Normally we would pull into the position here and do a static run up, check for minimum torque on those top torque gauges on the right. Unfortunately, I could not get the brakes to hold, parking brake on or full manual brakes. I could not get the brakes to hold. The aircraft started rolling as soon as I got a little power in there. And I just had to try to sneak up the torque to an acceptable level, and it just wasn't realistic. Sometimes on hot days, we just sit there for a minute or so watching the torque creep up to the minimum value. Normally about 100 knots to get airborne. So you can maintain control in case of an engine loss, positive rate, gear up. And we're going to just climb to a low altitude here, make a tactical departure down down the Autobahn, almost said interstate. And we're going to be heading out towards the area where I flew a lot when I was at Simbach Air Base. Simbach Air Base is by car probably 20 minutes from Ramstein. Ramstein was the fighter base, also the head of air forces in Europe. Simbach was the 17th Air Force headquarters, which was actually over USAF or Air Forces Europe. Now you can see there's the Autobahn, and we'll turn down the Autobahn and just head on out that way. Now I was saying the mission was difficult. We had 5 radios in the aircraft. We had a UHF com radio, a VHF com radio, like most light airplanes use now. Those were both for mostly ATC. And then we had also 2 FM radios for contacting ground troops and also squadron communications between the OV-10 and ground forces, Air Force ground forces. And then we also had an HF radio where we could contact long distances, a shortwave radio. So we would be listening to all 5 of these radios at the same time, and it was kind of demanding to try to adjust the volumes. We would carry a grease pencil, and on that big canopy, we would write our briefing information with a black grease pencil. And it would normally, right there where we're looking, it would be smeared with all sorts of clearances and directions for the fighters. Fighters would come in, and we would have brief them up and send them into the target. That was our job, really, as a communication liaison. But you had to fly the airplane too, and we stayed at low altitude for threat mitigation. Now we're coming up on a turn here where this river is. I'm going to head up a valley to a little town called Otterbach. And this is the way I drove from Ramstein back. I'd head up to Otterbach and then make a right turn to Otterberg. And Otterberg is where I lived for 3 years. Really a great time out there, and this airplane was a riot to fly once you got over the idea that you weren't flying a jet anymore. It was kind of fun. Didn't go fast, but it was definitely fun flying low, and we could pretty much fly anywhere we wanted at 500 feet or so. We'll make a right turn here and head over towards Otterberg. Kind of following the valley here. And once you flew around for a while in the almost all of Germany, you pretty much knew your way around. It was kind of fun to just keep flying around low level. You'd learn all the radio towers and mountains, and occasionally we had beautiful weather like this, mostly in the fall. Sometimes we were working below some pretty low overcasts, but going 200 knots, it's not too difficult. We'll make a couple turns around Otterberg just for old time's sake. I'll see if I can spot the house I used to live in there. And after that, we'll head over to Simbach Air Base, which is now an industrial park, but I can show you where the runway was. Now, just about 10 o'clock, well, 10 o'clock now is about where I lived. There you'll see a driveway. I don't know if I can spot it here as we're flying over. Even at this fairly low speed. There, we're looking right down the street there. I have it in sight, just below the canopy rail, top canopy rail. Right, I'll put a marker on there, right there. And I parked in a park plots right there. And we're turning right around it right now. We're just doing a nice tight turn around the place where I was living for 3 years. We lived with a German family in a 2-family house. We had the upstairs, they had the downstairs. I got to know them very well, and it was just a great experience. We made many memories that'll last a lifetime. So let's roll out of this turn towards the east, and we'll head over towards Simbach Air Base, or should I say the former Simbach Air Base. Unlike the U.S., the Germans kind of manage their farmland and woodlands, and little villages tend to be tightly compacted together and opening up a lot of space for the woods and the outdoors. So it's kind of neat the way they have things set up. It's not quite as sprawling like we have in the U.S. Little road under us is the road I took to work. It was only about a 10-12 minute drive. The speed limit in Germany, there's 3 limits. No limit on the Autobahn. In the city limits, it's 50 kilometers per hour, or 31 miles an hour, and 62 on that road you saw there. Now, okay, now here's the airport coming up straight ahead. It's kind of a green area where the runway used to be. We're looking right down the runway. You can see it just across this highway. And underneath the airplane now, you can see the airport. And the end of the runway, they've put a wind generator there, a windmill. And the flight line was off to the left. And there we can see the flight line to the left of the aircraft. And the old runway is the green area underneath. You can kind of see the outline of the runway there. Now, far off in the distance on the left, there's a hill, and that's where the administrative part of the base and where the 17th Air Force headquarters. Here you can see a solar farm and a wind generator here on the old land that was the previous base and has now become an industrial park. And they're looking down the runway again. Here's a view looking in the same direction at the base when it was still active. Days like this weren't common in Germany, but they were beautiful. There you can see the administrative part of the base, and everything but the flight line was in a separate area, separate security and everything. Base sets a couple hundred feet above the flight line, and there were times when this fog would roll in and we could go up on the base and be on top, and we'd be not flying for the whole day. Let's swing back over the field one more time before we head back. Take a look, see what, get one more look at the old Simbach Air Base. Kind of sad. Makes you feel really old when the places where you used to fly airplanes have turned into industrial parks. Of course, this was before the days of GPS and inertial navigation, not on this airplane. So we were flying by pilotage mostly. We would put a map on our knee and orient it the way we're flying and just look outside and navigate around that way. We also had topographic charts that were very detailed for target identification. Now head back out over the airfield one more time. And just off into the runway, you'll see a major highway, a two-lane highway, but a major highway coming up here shortly. And off to the left here, one day when we were flying in the squadron, an F-4 dropped out of the sky from another base. They were doing some high-level maneuvering and they lost control, bailed out, and the airplane crashed right next to our runway, just off the property across that road. And it was a big scare for our wives and for the people at the airbase because they just assumed one of our airplanes crashed in the landing pattern, but it was actually an F-4. Now, as we head out here, just reminds me of how beautiful it was in Germany, but there's some scarred up areas too here. But we're going to head out towards Kaiserslautern and take the shortcut back over towards the Autobahn. You can see a beautiful day for flying. We'll start to climb up towards the pattern altitude, and we'll get lined up for one of the runways landing to the west. They have two runways here that are probably 20 degrees off, maybe. It's kind of an unusual configuration. I think limited by the Autobahn and the terrain. Plane was a handful flying single engine. It's underpowered, 716 horsepower on each side. Typical landing weight, probably 10,000 pounds or so. So it's a little bit underpowered, and even in Europe with fairly cool temperatures back in those days, was difficult. Also on takeoff, we had no simulator, so we never got to practice a V1 cut ever. If we lost an engine on takeoff, it was going to be the first time. Now we did have a 0-0 ejection seat. There you can see the runways out ahead. We had a 0-0 ejection seat, which gave us a chance if we couldn't maintain control. We'd pull the power to idle and roll the wings level and pull the handle. I never really liked the idea that my first engine failure on takeoff in the OV-10 was going to be a real one. But there was no simulators that could, it was just too expensive in those days to have a simulator for a small fleet like the OV-10. Anyway, as we approach the airport, we need to get the condition levers and take off and land. The RPM should go right on up to 97%, which doesn't happen. We'll put the gear down and get our flaps out, and we'll be doing the landing checklist, and we'll be on the ground shortly. Try to keep the speed 100 minimum. If you have a long runway, speed is life when it comes to this airplane. When we're doing short field, we would go right down to below VMC, and if you lost the engine, you're going to have to bail out. You weren't going to be able to control the airplane. Here again, you can see the weird configuration of the runways here. This airplane was noisy, as I said. I got a chuckle out of someone who said in one of the notes that when they opened the canopy, the engines didn't get louder. I mean, that it was the same level of noise. And I can tell you that we wore a helmet and an earplugs in this thing, and it didn't get any. It was pretty much just as noisy outside and inside. That plexiglass didn't provide much protection from noise. So we wore a form-fitted helmet plus the earplugs. So the speed can bleed down to about 100 knots here. That's on a long runway. That's a nice safe speed. We'll hold 100 knots till we're in the flare or till the landing's assured. Once we're sure we're landing, we can bleed some of that airspeed off. Typically in a short field, we might be flying 85, and it's really squirrely. I'm going to land long here because we have a turnoff pretty far down the runway, and this thing can probably land in 1,000, 1,500 feet if we use max reverse thrust. So we'll get her on the ground, and once the mains are down, we'll get a reverse thrust coming in. And as I said, it's very effective. And we're going to exit the runway here and taxi back to that ramp where we started. Of course, as we clear the runway, we'll do the after landing check, and one of those items would be get the condition levers back to normal to lower the noise level. And again, I said, as before, I said we'll be taxiing using differential reverse thrust. That's the normal way, and it's too bad we can't practice that on this simulator yet. All in all, it's a great simulator. Don't get me wrong. I've said the textures, the modeling is beautiful. There's just a few little kinks that need to be worked out, and I'm sure they will. But I hope maybe that chart that I put in here, if someone could forward that, if you know the developers, maybe they could take a look at that. And also really need a good way to use to map all those condition lever and power lever positions to the hardware, be it a Honeycomb Bravo or any throttle quadrant. I feel kind of funny making demands on a developer that's giving away a great product like this. This is a very nice uh, freeware airplane, and I'm just tickled that they have something that I've flown, and I'm really enjoying playing around with it. But I would like to see those improvements, and hopefully that'll happen. Now, as we come into stop, to lock the props in flat pitch, we're going to have to pull the uh, condition levers to fuel shutoff. And as we do that, we're going to pull the throttles into full reverse thrust and hold them there until the rotation stops. Those locking pins the centrifugal force will allow them to lock into position and hold the pitch flat, and they'll stay there until the next time the airplane started. Unfortunately, I can't pull the full reverse on this thing. I'm just doing kind of to get them in the final position as best I can. And it looks like I left the flaps down too. So downgrade me on that. But anyway, also they stop pretty quickly, much quicker when they should stop much quicker rotating because you're pulling reverse thrust and it's putting more air load on the engines. But anyway, get them stopped in flat pitch, and that's the end. We're ready to do the after landing checklist and head home. You can get the Ariebaba OV-10A Bronco at flightsim.to at the URL you see here. And here's the URL for the European camouflage paint scheme that you can use with the Ariebaba OV-10 Alpha. I know this has been a little long and I probably should have broken it into pieces, but I wanted to share everything I had all in one video. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you do, please share with your friends, like, subscribe. I love your comments. And I hope I'll see you in my next video. Thanks a lot.